This is the true story of a very bigoted, prejudiced man, a one-time Golden Glove champion boxer and an alcoholic, whose life was transformed by the power of God.
We were sharecroppers. When I was 6, I picked 100 pounds of cotton a day. We 4 kids didn't go to school till after the cotton was picked in December. We'd only go when it rained, and I was always embarrassed because the other kids would tease us. "Here comes Paul. It must have rained." We were like the weather report. Buddy started boxing at the North Little Rock Boys Club, and the physical director, Joe Red, took an interest in him. Before long, he was an outstanding amateur fighter and well known. I started boxing too. At that time, we were so poor, about the only thing we had to live for was boxing and our mother. Buddy entered me in a boxing match at the Memphis Inner City Show. We had to leave from the boys' club early in the morning, but we didn't have any transportation. So we asked Jimmy Lipkin, a black neighbor, if he would give us a ride, and he said he would. I didn't win that fight. In 1944, Buddy won the National Golden Gloves Championship.
In June of 1969, Mama went to the hospital for the last time. She had been in and out so much with a little bit of everything, and now it was cancer. Life hadn't been easy for her, married to an alcoholic, dirt poor Arkansas sharecropper with 4 children. Daily, Mama got worse, and the doctors said they'd never seen anyone suffer like she suffered. They didn't know why she was still living. As we stood there by her bed, I couldn't take it any longer. I didn't say a thing. I just walked out of the room and down the hall to the bathroom, went in and closed the door. I looked up with tears in my eyes and said, "God, if you will let her live until Sunday, I'll give my heart to you." Sunday morning, Barbara and the children got ready, and as I drove to church, I became nervous. I knew that a lot of things were going to change in my life. When the invitation was given, nothing could have stopped me from going to that altar. If the preacher hadn't given an invitation, I would have gone anyhow. As I walked into the aisle, my wife stepped out behind me, Paul Jr. after her, Paula after him, and then Philip. We all knelt at the altar. The people in the church knew about me because Mama had been going there for years and requesting prayer so many times. They all gathered around me at the altar. That's it. For me, anything I did, it was all or nothing, good sinner or good saint.
After I became a Christian, I had just little enough sense to think that I was supposed to invite everybody to church. I had 3 black boys on my American Legion baseball team, but it was easy to see that they wouldn't be welcome in our church. I didn't understand that, and it was hard for me to accept.
Then I decided to talk to our district superintendent, Tom Herman, about starting a mission church. Not a black church, but a church where anyone would be welcome, no matter who they were.
There were a few things I wanted to talk to Brother Herman about, so I called him up and we set a time to have dinner together. Over dinner, we talked about a number of things, and I was doing most of the talking. Then Brother Herman reached across the table and put his hand on mine and asked, "Doc, don't you think you've been called to the full-time ministry?" I just broke down and cried. I didn't know anyone suspected what I felt. "Brother Herman, I know I have," I confessed. "I'm just scared to admit it." But that night, I really yielded to God's call, a call I had heard from the beginning of Friendly Chapel.
Then a past experience began to haunt me. It had happened several years earlier in 1957 when the state was upset with the integration issue. The National Guard was called in when Central High in Little Rock was integrated. I had been on the fire department 3 years, and we were all standing out in front of the station cheering the National Guard troops and booing the blacks. "Go get those," we yelled. There was so much hostility. We even talked of getting guns and going out in our cars to kill somebody. We hated them. One day, when we were standing out in front of the station, I recognized Jimmy Lipton, our black sharecropper neighbor, who had given me a ride so many times. He was coming down the street, and I knew he would recognize me. At first, I thought I would just go inside until he went by. But then I thought if I turned sideways, he might not recognize me. But as he got closer, he did recognize me and stuck out his hand and said, "Mr. Paul." I couldn't shake hands with him. What would the fellows at the station think? I stuck my hands in my back pocket, pretending I didn't see his hand. I would never forget the look on his face. I'd never seen a man hurt any worse. I went into the station and got off by myself and cried, and even then asked God to forgive me for the horrible thing I had done. I made a promise that I would never again let what people think bother me when I knew I was right.
After I'd preached 3 or 4 sermons at Friendly Chapel, I was invited by the pastor D.L. Lindsay to preach at a black church in North Little Rock. After the service that night, 2 women came up and said they remembered me for they had picked cotton with me. "We read that article in the paper. It was so good," they told me. "You know whose hand I refused to shake and who I was talking about, don't you?" I asked. "No," they said. "You didn't give his name." "Oh, that's right," I said. "I didn't. It's Jimmy Lipkin. I'm sure he's dead now." "No, he's not dead. He lives out in Dixie Addition." I was so excited about the news. Now I could ask him to forgive me. I had asked God to forgive me, and now God had led me to Jimmy. The next night, Barbara and I drove out to the Dixie Addition about dusk. We got out of the car, walked up to the little house, knocked on the door. An older lady came to the door, and I asked, "Miss Lipkin?" She replied, "Yes." "Do you know who I am?" She looked at me and said, "I don't believe I do." "Well, is Jimmy here?" "Yes," she answered. "Could you call him out before I tell you who I am?" So she called to him. A small and beautiful man came to the door. He had his shirt off and looked years younger than his age. He kind of popped back and looked at me up and down, just like a little banty rooster. I spoke. "Do you know who I am?" "Sure, I know who you are," he said, and stuck out his hand. "Mr. Dunlap." Barbara and I laughed, and I said, "No, Jimmy, I'm Paul Holderfield." They both threw their arms around me and then embraced Barbara and me. What a reunion. The tears of joy just flowed. "Jimmy, I don't guess you read in the paper where the Lord saved me." "No," he said. "I didn't know you were a Christian." They invited us in, and I read the article that was written in the Herald of Holiness about my conversion. I passed that church so many times and wondered, seeing black folks and white folks going in there, what kind of church it was, Jimmy said. "I want to ask you a question," I told him. "Do you remember back in 1957? Before I even got it out of my mouth, he started nodding his head and smiling. "Yes, I was coming home from my job and passed by that fire station, Paul. I knew why you didn't shake my hand. I knew you were worried about those firemen you were working with. I understand." "No, you don't understand, Jimmy," I told him. "The only reason in the world I did that was because I was a sinner. Now that I'm a Christian, nothing in the world could make me treat anyone that way. I was such a fool. I thought I was so much better than you, and oh, how much better you were than me. You were a Christian, a real Christian. But thank God, Jimmy, I just want you to know that I'm as good as you are now. I'm a Christian too." We all laughed, and what a good evening we spent together with them as brothers and sisters in Christ. I invited Jimmy to come to Friendly Chapel so we could publicly acknowledge before God and man our love for each other. That Sunday morning I stepped in the pulpit and told the real story behind Friendly Chapel. Jimmy had a lot more to do with starting this church than I did. If I had shaken hands with him that day, this church never would have been started. Jimmy came to the pulpit, and even the children hushed to hear his words. The time has come for the Lord to unite us together. The greatest thing is love. How are you going to love God if you hate me? I love everyone. I don't care how white you are, how black you are. I love you. Jimmy turned to me. I stood and stepped up to him, and he put my arm on his shoulder and stretched out his hand. Jimmy took my hand, and the handshake I had been waiting for 18 years became a reality. Every time I visited or whenever I was asked to preach, I shared that story. It was such a living message.